Hello there. I hope you're doing well. In today's presentation, we're going to be looking at this idea of biological beginnings, all right, where life kind of comes from, and I'm going to try to be making this connection between evolutionary psychology and developmental psychology, right? And that developmental psychology is how an organism changes within a lifespan, whereas evolutionary psychology is looking at how changes occur across generations. All right. Hope you're doing well. Grab a coffee and let's get into it. Cheers. Or you don't have to drink coffee. Just grab your pen and paper, nice warm drink or whatever you like, and it's good to spend some time with you. Let's get into it.
Life. With an estimated 3.8 billion years of existence and evolution on Earth, it's an odd thing indeed. So how did we get here? And what would the Earth's 4.5 billion year timeline look like compressed into a normal day of 24 hours? The story begins early in the morning, around 4 a.m., with the rise of the first simple, single-celled organisms. However, these organisms are destined to spend quite some time alone. At 1 p.m., a simple cell engulfs another, creating a symbiotic relationship and the first eukaryotic cells, or cells with internal organs. At 6:30 p.m., these cells begin to form colonies, and thus the first multicellular life develops. But it isn't until 8:30 p.m. that sea plants appear, and 20 minutes later we suddenly see animal life erupt in an explosion of inventiveness. Jellyfish, the first true vertebrates, trilobites. Incredible diversification begins to take place, and just before 10 p.m., plants begin to appear on land, followed by land mammals. By 1024, the Earth is covered in carboniferous forests, and the first winged insects appear. Many reptiles dominate the land with less than an hour left, but a mass extinction event allows dinosaurs to storm the scene and remain until 11:41 p.m. when they too suddenly vanish. And so begins the age of mammals. In the last few minutes, apes split from the old world monkeys, and with only 1 minute and 17 seconds left before midnight, humans emerge. All of the recorded human history fits within a few seconds, an individual life lasting barely an instant. All a culmination of 3.8 billion years of life. This ASAP Science video was made possible by the support of Audible.com. With their help, we're able to continue making fun science videos, and they want to give you a free audiobook. Audible is the internet's leading provider of audiobooks with more than 100,000 downloadable titles across all different types of literature, including fiction, nonfiction, and periodicals. Just go to audible.com/ASAP to get a free audiobook of your choice. Today's episode was inspired by the book A Short History of Nearly Everything, in which Bill Bryson explores the neatest bits of science, my personal recommendation. Again, just head over to audible.com/ASAP to download it for free or another audiobook of your choice. And subscribe for more weekly science videos.
In this presentation, we're going to be looking at the biology behind some of these questions, like these fundamental human questions, like who are we and who are we trying to become and how are we becoming and what does the word becoming even mean in an evolution or biological sense, developmental sense, what makes us change, how do we grow old, what even is aging from a biology perspective, why do you have certain preferences, why do you like certain things over others, and why don't everyone in the same family like all the same things? Why is there so much diversity of preference? It's actually a pretty difficult question psychology-wise. Why do we die? Why this whole issue of mortality and what makes some people kind of better at some things than others? And we've all seen that throughout our lives, whether we're talking about like musical skill or athleticism or intellect or sense of humor. All right, so we're going to be looking at this idea today of the kind of nature side of the story. So I don't know, I'll in the future get better with this, but one of the things with those videos is like, I found that I just have less problems making the recording if I leave the entire video in, because I know it's like, you might have been thinking like, why don't I snip off the end of all those videos? And I've tried doing that in the past. I don't know what I'm doing wrong, except maybe I have to like actually alter the video and save it and then, but you know, I'm thinking about that. That last point too, I don't really like that. I disagree philosophically with that point that like the trick is now that everyone has to just like not have kids, right? That population growth is the huge evil, when that's like just scientifically demonstrably not true, and actually the opposite of what's true. Humans are new to the planet, and I mean new, and I kind of like bolded new, right? And I'm kind of saying it tongue in cheek, new in ecological time, right? Or geographical time. Sometimes people say in terms of like, compared to like trees, humans are very new. But we share the DNA of the first eukaryotes, the first multi-cell organisms. Like, one thing I was talking about genetics the other day with my class at Conestoga, and I really try to like encourage students to like, biology, some of the language is maybe a bit dry or whatever, but if you let your mind kind of think about how intense this is, that like we carry this, the surviving DNA history of like this entirely huge and mind-blowing group of people, that it would completely blow our minds if we knew the whole story. We know such a small part of the story, right? Some of the earliest writing is like a few thousand years old. I think about 2,500 years old, right? So like, or maybe 2,500 BC. So let's say maybe like, you know, whatever, 5,000 years old. Now I'm gonna be like looking this up as soon as I'm done this slide. But right, some of the first writing, it's like you see some of the first examples of written text, especially in the Middle East with like the Sumerians and like taking records, and like the story of Gilgamesh is like one of the oldest, right? And like, that's only a few thousand years ago. And I think human beings have been at our state for what, 200,000 years? There's a lot of time in between there. You know, people make funny statements like, we share a lot of our DNA with like a banana, or even with a chimp. You'll hear people say that. It's like, you know, human beings have a high genetic similarity with a chimp. It's our closest thing, and it is. And it's actually kind of interesting that like a chimp is closer to us than to a gorilla, but that difference is huge. That little bit of difference is massive. What makes us human is the arrangement of DNA, right? That the actual chemicals in the DNA are similar to other creatures. Despite sharing the same DNA as billions, each person's DNA is individualized, right? Like yours is your unique signature. And it's only our DNA that makes us, oh no, sorry, I say this question, right, of like, is it only our DNA that makes us what we are? Because if you were to take this perspective, you can quickly get to like a very biological determinism perspective, right? Determinism, whenever you hear that word, what's that mean? That like something determines something, that your biology is this way, so it determines this, right? That it'd be kind of like the opposite end of the argument from free will. I'm going to make the point through this course that it's like some complicated combo, right? It's obviously nature and nurture. You have a nature that's born into a world that nurtures that nature for better or worse. So, okay, next slide.
Mechanisms of evolution. What is evolution? Evolution is the development of life on Earth. This is a process that began billions of years ago and is still continuing to this day. Evolution tells us how it was possible for the enormous diversity of life to develop. It shows us how primitive protozoa could become the millions of different species that we see today. Evolution, then, is the answer to the question that we have all asked on seeing a dachshund and a Great Dane together. How is it possible for ancestors to have descendants that look so very different to them? In answering this question, we want to focus on animals, excluding other forms of life such as fungi and plants. The first question to ask is therefore, how can one animal develop into a whole new species of animal? But just a quick question. What exactly is a species? A species is a community of animals that is capable of producing offspring with one another, with those offspring also being capable of reproducing in turn. To understand this answer better, we need to take a closer look at the following points. The uniqueness of living creatures, guaranteed through the excess production of offspring and heredity, and, as a second key point, selection. Let's begin with uniqueness. Every creature that exists is unique, and this is essential for evolution. The members of a species may strongly resemble each other in appearance, however, they all have slightly different traits and characteristics. They may be a bit bigger, fatter, stronger, or bolder than their fellow animals. So what is the reason for these differences? Let's take a closer look at a creature. Every creature is made up of cells. These cells have a nucleus. The nucleus contains the chromosomes, and the chromosomes hold the DNA. DNA consists of different genes, and it's these genes that are life's information carriers. They contain instructions and orders for the cells and determine the characteristics and traits that living creatures have. And it's precisely this DNA that is unique to every creature. It's slightly different from individual to individual, which is why each has slightly different characteristics. But how is the enormous range of DNA created? One key factor is the excess production of offspring. In nature, we can observe that creatures generally produce far more offspring than is necessary for the survival of their species, with many offspring dying an early death as a result. Often there are even more offspring than the environment in which they live is able to support. This is one factor in increasing diversity within a species. The more offspring that are produced, the more little differences occur. And this is what nature wants, as many little differences as possible. The second major cause of the uniqueness of individuals occurs in heredity itself. By the way, heredity means the passing on of DNA to offspring. Two very interesting factors come into play in this process: recombination and mutation. Recombination is the random mixing of the DNA of two creatures. When two creatures fall in love and mate, they recombine their genes twice. The first time they do this separately, when they generate the gametes, that is, sperm and egg cells. The gametes take half of the genes and shuffle them. The second recombination occurs when a male inseminates a female. The parents each provide 50% of their DNA, in other words, 50% of their unique traits and characteristics. These are then recombined or mixed, and the result is new offspring. These offspring have a random mix of the DNA and therefore the traits and characteristics of their parents. This increases the diversity and differences within a species even further. But mutations are also important for evolution. Mutations are random changes in DNA. These can also be described as copying errors within the DNA, triggered by toxins or other chemical substances or by radiation. A mutation exists when a part of the DNA is altered. These changes are often negative and may result in illnesses such as cancer. However, they may also have neutral or positive effects, such as the blue eye color in humans, which is one such random mutation. In all cases, a mutation has to affect a gamete, that is, a sperm or egg cell, because only the DNA in the gametes is passed on to the offspring. This is also the reason why we protect our sexual organs during X-rays, whilst other parts of the body are not at risk. In summary then, in the heredity process, creatures pass on their characteristics to their offspring in the form of DNA. Recombination and mutation change the DNA so that each child looks different to its siblings and receives a random mix of the characteristics of its parents. There's a key word here: random. All of these processes are based on chance. Random recombination and mutations result in individuals with random mixes of traits and characteristics, which in turn mix these randomly and pass them on. But how can so much be down to chance when all living creatures are so perfectly adapted to their environment? For example, the stick insect, the hummingbird, and the frogfish. The answer is provided by the second key point, selection. Each individual is subjected to a process of natural selection. As we have learned, each individual is somewhat different to its fellows, and there is extensive variation within a species. Environmental influences have an effect on living creatures. These so-called selection factors include predators, parasites, animals of the same species, toxins, changes in habitat, or the climate. Selection is a process that each individual is subjected to. Every creature has a unique mix of traits and characteristics. This mix helps them to survive in their environment, or not, as the case may be. Anyone with an unsuitable mix will be selected from the environment. Those with the right mix survive and can pass on their enhanced traits and characteristics. This is why diversity is so important. This is why creatures make so much effort to produce offspring that are as different as possible. They increase the likelihood that at least one of their offspring passes nature's selection process. They maximize their chances of survival. A good example of this can be seen in a group of finches living on a remote island. They are some of the most famous animals in the world of science and are known as Darwin finches, after their discoverer, Charles Darwin. And this is the story of those finches. A few hundred years ago, a small group of finches was blown onto the Galapagos Islands in the middle of the Pacific, probably by a big storm. The finches found themselves in an environment that was completely new to them, a real finch paradise, an abundance of food, and no predators. They reproduced rapidly and numerously. The islands were soon heaving with finches. This meant that food supplies became increasingly scarce. The finch paradise was threatened with famine, and finch friends became competitors. This is when selection intervened. Their individuality and small differences, in this case their slightly different beaks, meant that some of the birds were able to avoid competing with their fellow finches. The beaks of some of the finches were more suitable for digging for worms. Other finches were able to use their beaks better for cracking seeds. The finches consequently sought out ecological niches. In these niches, they were safe from excessive competition. They soon began to mate primarily with other finches that used the same niche. Over the course of many generations, these characteristics were enhanced, enabling the finches to exploit their niches successfully. The differences between the worm diggers and the seed crackers became so large that they were no longer able to mate with one another. Different species emerged as a result. Today there are 14 different species of finch living on the Galapagos Islands, all of which are descended from the same group of stranded finches. This is how new species are created by evolution. Through the interaction of unique individuals, the excess production of offspring, recombination and mutation in heredity, and finally, through selection. Why is this so important? It tells us where the variety of life comes from and why living creatures are so perfectly adapted to their habitats. But it also affects us personally. Every person is the result of 3.5 billion years of evolution. And that includes you. Your ancestors fought and adapted in order to survive. This survival was an extremely uncertain thing. If we consider the fact that 99% of all the species that have ever lived are extinct, then you can consider yourself part of a success story. The dinosaurs have disappeared, but you are alive, watching this video. Because you're incredibly special, just like all the other creatures that exist today. Irreproducible and unique in the universe.
So when we're talking about Darwin, that last video, I thought like, I'm gonna try to like, I don't need to like do a review of each video after them, but like, I've tried to pick videos to sort of illustrate in some way what I'm talking about, and sometimes, especially when you're talking about biology style topics, like an animation can go a far way. So I hope that that's helpful. So Darwin had this idea, right, that like evolution was what caused the whole animal kingdom, and the proliferation of species would be what he would say, and that humans were part of that somehow. Now what's important though is like Darwin didn't think this was like some light idea, right? That like he knew what this was saying. He knew how this was going to be interpreted by the church. He knew how this was going to rock Europe specifically, and the broader world to a certain extent. He worried about it. He wrote about his worry about it. He thought that he might be wrong, right? Like he famously wrote about how he thought that the human eye was so advanced. Like how could the human eye have evolved? The eye really bothered him, bothered his dreams. And he also knew like what was going to happen to society, right? That like for thousands of years, Europe had been focused on this kind of Judeo-Christian worldview for thousands of years that really shaped their understanding of new information. And all of a sudden, if you pull that underpinning out, that Darwin, and this is sort of slipping into the ideas of what Nietzsche thought, that like people will just fill that in with politics, right? People will just fill in the religious void with politics, and they'll think that they're not religious people, and they'll be religious about ideology, right? That's one of like Nietzsche's warnings. Carl Jung warned about that too. Darwin thought that this intense constant struggle for food and water and resources occurs amongst the young of each generation because some of them don't survive, and he's especially looking at like other animals, right? That like you look at why like a rabbit has these big litters, and it's because, well, some don't make it, and so it's almost like nature sets, and it's in a way it is related to humans, and why like siblings are so different. It's like oftentimes it's all linked to that last video that you saw, that randomness and that diversity, and that creates a situation where some organisms, some individuals are better situated to their environment, survival of the fittest to the environment, not like the fittest necessarily strongest, although that could be the case. Lots of times in the animal kingdom, fittest means like able to go the longest without water, or take the coldest temperature. Oh, I forgot to, wait a sec here. There's a little bit of a computer hum, so I try to cancel that with a little bit of, frequency 528. Those that do then produce, pass on the characteristics to the next generation. So I'm doing this in PowerPoint with the teleprompter mode, so it's actually pretty slick. I have my notes right on top. I shouldn't have said that. I should pretend like I've just memorized it. Although if you open up the PowerPoint, I don't know if you can see it. Anyways, over the course of many generations, organisms with the characteristics needed for survival make up an increasing percentage of the population. So like think about that, right? if there's a situation where only some are surviving and then those ones are passing on their genes, it's like the situation is fine-tuning gene development. And that's kind of what this survival of the fittest idea means. The term survival of the fittest refers to the ability to bear offsprings that will survive long enough to bear offsprings of their own, right? So that's kind of the goal of the gene. The goal of the gene is for the creature to grow old enough that they can have their own baby and pass on the gene again, right? Thus, this has this like tendency towards favoring behaviors related to reproductive success, the ability to pass genes to the next generation. Okay, so future generations. I can switch. Okay, sorry. I don't need to say that a lot. So I can switch back to this because I got to see if I have more points down so I don't wreck the recording. Yes, this is the last point for this slide. The future generations will result from their own evolution, right? Which is just this interesting way of saying that, like, obviously evolution doesn't stop with us, right? It's not like you're the last. Well, I guess it depends. It depends on if you have kids, right? So like the genetic continuity. But it's this idea that, like, obviously evolution wasn't the whole past until 2022. It's like this is a part of this longer chain that's pre-existed us and will post-exist us. This next video, I can see the next slide coming up, and it's cool animation. I hope you like it. So here's a good definition for you: that natural selection, the process by which those individuals of a species are best adapted to their environment, are the ones that are most likely to survive and reproduce. So those ones are the ones that are best adapted to the environment, are the ones most likely to survive and reproduce. So notice that there's like incredible potential for different scenarios there, right? Because best adapted to the environment could mean a million different things, right? I've said a few, like being able to go a long time without water, or being able to have skin that can be exposed to water all the time, like an amphibious creature, or like being able to deal with massive changes in temperature, or being able to deal with long times without food, like, I don't know, certain kinds of snakes. And then it's like all these different things have different adaptive values. And Darwin also thought, though, that these things were related to advanced cognitive systems, even, right? Like I say, their cognition in general, but also like the whole act of perception, right? Some people, you almost have to look at this like a whole bunch of people at one time, and some people had certain characteristics, and those characteristics help them outperform the people around them. Because here's the other piece that often people for some reason seem to forget, that Darwin talked about natural selection and also sexual selection, and that sexual selection is actually super powerful too, right? Because there's a choice dynamic in quote unquote mating, or in sexual reproduction, in all these species, right, including humans, that influences this genes passing to the next level. But that's complicated, so it's easier to just talk about natural selection. But sexual selection, Darwin talked about as the second part of that story. It's pretty interesting, right? And you see how like certain behaviors, like it's really easy to see in other animals, right? Like you look at like everything that would be generally considered a display behavior, and it's not like humans don't do display behaviors, but like you look at, like, for example, the bird kingdom. I think I might have just said this and not finished the point, but the bird kingdom is like ripe with examples, right? Like if you ever watch that Netflix show, it's like Dancing Birds, and my daughter thought it was hilarious, and it's like, I'm like, yeah, it's hilarious how they like to dance, and it's like, I'm not going to tell her the fact that it's all just like, it's all trying to stimulate the reaction in the opposing, well, in the target other bird, right? It's the reproductive dance, and it's shaped to like the coloring of species, the coloring of different feathers. I don't know, birds just do it so dramatically. So now think about that for a second and kind of step back a little bit and be like, okay, so what's Darwin sort of saying? He's saying that in certain environments, only those genes that basically that are in an organism that reaches the age of reproduction and can have their own babies, only those ones go to the next generation. So getting there becomes important, and therefore there's a lot of the behaviors that are associated with getting to that stage get more hardwired, and the organisms that don't have those are more likely to not pass on their genes, therefore not contribute to the future gene pool. Right? I would now say this is like part of the story. This is definitely like a deep, groundbreaking idea. Natural selection is up there with the unconscious. It's like one of the biggest ideas. Right? So this is like right around the turn of the century. He's writing this in like the 1890s. And then you could put some natural selection. You could put, I should have had it on here, but that sexual selection then is like the intentional choosing of one mate over a different one. So one of the newer approaches in psychology is this kind of subdivision of evolutionary psych. I remember I think when I was in school, it was still sort of a subdivision of developmental psych, maybe biological psych. I don't know I don't remember evolutionary psych being its own like wing of a university psych department. I don't know if it works like that at Nipsing. I'm kind of using Waterloo as my example, but now evolutionary psychology is absolutely a thing, and it's really focused on this idea of how this survival of the fittest idea and this biologically determined need of the gene to reach reproductive age to reproduce, to continue the gene pool, shapes other behaviors and even shapes things like how we perceive the world and how we use language and how we behave socially. And that there's even group behavior that evolves through this kind of cultural group selection. Now that's interesting, right? It's like even how we behave in a group setting can be influenced by evolutionary forces around like what makes certain groups more likely to survive and what makes certain people more likely to achieve status in certain communities, because maybe that's linked to reproduction. It's like none of this has to be conscious. That's the other thing. It's like it's not like people throughout time have been like, what can I do to increase my evolutionary reproductive? That's kind of not the theory. The theory is that this is biological, or this is, another way you could say this is like quite unconscious, right? That this is an influence or a it's a better word than influence, like a need or a, because that's an interesting thing, right? Because what even the word need means in psychology, it sort of means a different thing than in just common speech. In psychology, a need is something that needs to be addressed, right? So it's weird how I use that word twice, I guess, in the same sentence, but it's different than a want in that it's experienced as a lack if you don't have it, right? So the deficiency-based understanding of the word need as opposed to like something you want. Yeah, so evolutionary psychology, super interesting. Let's keep looking at some of the main principles of evolutionary psychology here. Okay, one of the first principles that I want to talk about is oh yeah, okay. Wait. So if you're wondering what I'm doing here, I can see I'm in presenter mode, so I can see like what it's gonna look like if I press the button one more time. So I always do it until I see the next slide, so then I don't mess it up. This is just looking at this idea that like, well, how long is childhood, right? And that this longer childhood is related to higher amounts of brain development, right? And that human childhood being an extended time allows for an extended childhood period might have evolved because humans require time to develop this large brain, have these vital experiences, and learn the complexity of our society. Humans take longer to become reproductively mature than any other primate. And that I was talking about this to someone else the other day. It was kind of weird because it was in a totally different context, but we were talking about deer and how like deer are born able to run basically like as soon as they're born, but the price of that is cognitive, right? So like to have that wiring, because actually the wiring, I'm using it in kind of just a generic way, but like the wiring between, and it's the electric nervous system wiring from your brain to your feet forms, it's one of the last things to develop, right, and to get full control over, which is why like a baby can like manipulate things really well with their hands way before they can walk. So for the deer to have that like immediately, it's like it almost has to be born with a complete cognitive system where you weren't, right? Like you were born, you did some of your brain development outside of the womb, just like every other human being. And what does that do? It makes the infant very vulnerable, right? Like basically under the direct care of the parents. But what the benefit is if you look at it from a certain perspective, the entire pregnancy process is all about trying to be able to have a baby born with as big of a brain as possible, right? And I'm sorry to be kind of direct and a little bit, hopefully not graphic, but a little bit specific. It's like, how can a baby be born that won't kill the mother in the process, but to have a brain as big as possible? And nature's solution was to have the baby born with its skull not fully formed, right? Which is why the baby has the soft spot, and why that is so that the head has that potential to even have more cavity, a skull cavity space for brain. I think that kind of stuff is so neat. So yeah, so the number one proposition. So proposition, like kind of its starting point. It's like, okay, evolutionary psychology is basically saying like these three main things, and then a lot of things are points off of that. Okay, the second proposition I want to talk about: humans evolved domain-specific psychological mechanisms for specific needs. That's a full sentence, but it basically just means like humans as a group developed certain things because we needed to, because we were in certain problems, right? Because we were needing to develop these cognitive structures, there was demand. That demand led to kind of innovation in a biological sense. Many of our evolved psychological mechanisms are domain specific. So domain specific means like it's a thing that does a specific thing. It doesn't, which is the opposite. Domain specific is the opposite of saying in general, right? So like a specific intelligence would be like a GPS that does like amazing at GPS, but can't tell you how to make a salad, or a calculator, right? But then a generalized intelligence would be like an AI that could like do anything, right? That they don't have that yet, right? Another example would be like specific intelligence would be like an AI, a computer robot that you could make to like beat some video game, but maybe it can't play a different game, or maybe it can't hold like it can't use that intelligence in any applied generalized way like you can. But a lot of our specific mechanisms evolved domain specific, right? Like we developed a stress response to deal with like specific scenarios, right? Like that's maybe a good example of like the psychology around the stress response. I know a lot of stress response is physiological too. Right, but it's not like cortisol doesn't affect the thought patterns. It's not like a stress system doesn't affect your cognition. Humans evolved these. Yeah, so according to evolutionary psychology, the mind's not this general purpose device. Instead, our ancestors dealt with certain problems, such as hunting, protecting each other, finding shelter, and therefore specialized modules, right? Schemas, like a Piaget word, evolved that process information related to these problems. For example, modules might include modules for knowledge of things like how to track an animal, right? Like how to mathematical knowledge needed for training, or a module for language so that you can interact with other people. So that the idea is that the brain didn't just like kind of randomly have this potential and just randomly develop it, like actually had this potential, but was developing in response to environmental pressures. It's an evolved brain is the argument. And then the third one here is that how delicious does that bowl of candy look? But it's that evolved mechanisms, and right, think of mechanisms as like a fancy word of just meaning like things that happen, right? Like a mechanism is a word that's related to the word machine, or like a mechanism is something that does something. So a psychological mechanism is like, oh, your brain knows to respond to this by doing this, so it has like a mechanism for responding to that. It's just like language, really. Your brain's not literally a machine in that sense, but that we've evolved these certain ways of these certain mechanisms which do not always adapt well, right? Like the stress response I was talking about before, like the psychology of stress. It's like, that's great if you're like in a life or death scenario, but if you're sitting in traffic or about to do a presentation, it's actually hindering your performance and making you, less able to successfully glide through your experience. Some behaviors that were adapted for our prehistoric ancestors may not serve us well today. For example, food scarcity experienced by our ancestors led to humans' propensity to gorge when food is high in caloric. Engage in high caloric food. High caloric food is always the best. A trait that may be a factor in today's epidemic of obesity. Blah, blah, blah. Right? So it's like kind of obvious, right? So this is like a devastating point that, like, for our ancestors, it was very hard to get this kind of like high quality, high calorie food. It's like, and it's delicious, and it's like delicious for a reason. There's a reason why, like, you probably either like the sweets or the salts, right? It's like those were difficult to come by things. And it's not like we've evolved to not like that anymore. It's like we've been living in scenarios of food scarcity in that kind of scenario. Food scarcity is like a tough word. Basically, it just means like not having the choice to have those kind of things, right? Like it just wasn't part of a lot of people's diets. It's wild when you look into like how important things like sugar and spices and all that kind of trade was. It's like, I saw someone make a meme once, and it's like what we think would impress our ancestors, and it's like an iPhone. And it's like what would really impress our ancestors, and it's like the spice rack at a Walmart or something. It's like, and that their experience shaped our biology, right? So that's that last part, that like some reward systems that was like, it was rewarding because we needed it and it was hard to get, so getting it was something that needed to be rewarded, so that you're motivated to find more of whatever, like simple salts or whatever. But that those can become maladaptive or not helpful in your modern life, in a modern context, and like our current situation. Right, so the point is basically that just because it evolved doesn't mean it's helping you. So I thought this is kind of interesting, so I have something I want to read for you here. One of the interesting criticisms, I sometimes with these notes, what I'll do is like kind of just give a little bit more fuller overview of like the kind of key point on the slide. Like one of the main criticisms of an evolutionary perspective is that it can sound like this one-sided evolutionism, right? Which was Bandura's point, right? Remember Bandura, the guy from like the Bobo doll experiment? He had this social cognition theory, but Bandura thought that like, well, let's read this. One criticism comes from the cognitive theorist Albert Bandura. He acknowledged the important influence that evolution has on human adaptation. However, he rejects what he calls one-sided evolutionism, which sees social behavior as a product of these evolutionary biological characteristics. Bandura suggested as an alternative what he called a bidirectional view. Yeah, I have it there as a second point. Bidirectional, so just two directions, like back and forth, in which environment and biology condition, in which biological and environmental conditions influence each other. So this is from a paper his in 1998. In this view, evolutionary pressures create changes in biological structures that allow the use of tools which enable our ancestors to manipulate the environment, constructing new environmental conditions. Let me read that sentence again, because that's wild. Okay. In this view, these evolution pressures, right? So basically just like the pressure, because remember, nobody in there, none of your ancestors while they were living were thinking about themselves in this, like, at least in a day-to-day, moment-to-moment scenario, weren't thinking about their role in this broader evolution of mankind or whatever. It's like they were just living their life, right? But in their act of trying to survive and live their life, They were involved in this, living their life. They were living their life in an environment that was putting pressures on them, and those pressures, in this sense, we're calling evolutionary pressures. These evolutionary pressures create changes, even at a biological level, and it made them able to use certain kinds of tools, right? And like the history of humanity and the history of tool use is an interlocked story, which enabled our ancestors to manipulate the environment and make new environments. In turn, those new environments put new selection pressures on us. So like think about like how adding to the dating world cell phones changes, the selection pressures on people. In turn, these environmental innovations put new selection pressures that led to the evolution of specialized biological systems of consciousness and thought and language. Right? Humans started to be able to manipulate rock and tools and having needles so they could sew stuff, and obviously fire is a huge one, and then obviously down the road and with bronze and eventually even like more advanced metals really changed the game. Steel. In other words, evolution gave us bodily structures and biological potentialities, but it doesn't dictate behavior. Even in the simplest organisms, genes are not turned on and off like clockwork, but are rather subjected to a lot of random noise, which is why genetically identified fruit flies breed in controlled laboratory conditions can end up with unpredictable differences in their anatomy. This, even though they're basically saying, even if you take a fruit fly, which is like as simple of a creature as possible, and you raise it in the exact same scenario as another fruit fly, so you've controlled environment as much as possible and nature as much as possible, and it's as simple as an organism as possible. It's like even in a controlled scenario, there can be unprecedented differences in their anatomy. This genetic roulette must be given even more significance in an organism as complex as a human, and it tells us the two traditional shapers of a person, nature and nurture, must be augmented by a third, brute chance. Right? So this is actually Steven Pinker, but this is this idea that there's like almost nature, nurture, and then chance. It's not nature, nurture. And that's kind of the point that would be what like evolution added to that. This big picture idea of natural selection leading to the development of human traits and behaviors is difficult to argue, but it's also difficult to test. And that's mainly because, like that point I have at the bottom in red and highlighted, it's really hard to show like how does like exposure to like sexualized imagery on your computer, or like how does like kids having cell phones or whatever, how does that affect humans? It's like, well, that's going to be a really hard question to answer evolutionarily. It's because of like there's no way like humans aren't adapted to that. We're not even really evolved to artificial light yet, right? Evolution at a human level happens over long scales of time, making like testing and proving difficult. But again, it's like this becomes like a tiring argument a little bit in psychology from critics, is like, because you'll see that this kind of comes up over and over, right? It's like the big critique of Freud is like, okay, well, how do you prove the unconscious? It's like, yeah, but it's like you can't unprove it either. And it's like, then you get to like Maslow and self-actualization. How do you prove that? And it's like, well, you can't really prove it either. It's like we're not all like Skinner doing like, tick box, did the pigeon turn or not? Right, so it's like some types of psychology are difficult, some things in the world, some things in the reality are more difficult to measure. That doesn't mean it's like inherently not true or real. Okay, it looks like I froze there, but I think I don't know if I did. I think it's okay. All right, next slide. What's up, my friends? Part 2, even though it's the same video, coming to you live from my basement. It's not live, this is pre-recorded, but it is in my basement, and I do love yous. So, when we're talking about the genetic foundations of development, why do I tell my students I love them? I don't know, life's short. And I do care about my students, so I just say it, and I don't care if I sound silly. It's like, I never used to say that I love people, and then I lost people, and now I say I love people. our DNA is not just inherited from our parents, it's the entire collective inheritance from our species, right? And it's like, and obviously because trees branch differently, there's differences between people and between groups, right? The better word than race is populations. It makes more sense in terms, it's a more accurate word, right? That there's different populations of people all over the place, and they have different pressures, selection pressures, evolutionary pressures. But that our family tree goes very far back, right? Like you can find the mitochondria Eve. You could look that up, right? I don't know if it even sounds controversial to say there was like clearly a first human, right? And it didn't come from a chimp, right? You saw that really interesting word in one of those early animations I showed called a proconsul. What's a proconsul mean? It's like, they showed it as like an in-between step before humans. And so like this opens up so many interesting questions, right? Because I can obviously understand that if some of you are religious, it sounds like, am I talking about an Adam and Eve scenario, or am I talking about evolution? And it's like, well, or are those different ways of talking about a similar thing, or do we have to argue about it, or could it really be this idea that like humanity is very old, right? And life is very old, and it seems like there was a specific thing that changed humans into something different than everything else. And if it was purely evolution, then it's purely evolution. If it was divine intervention, then it was divine intervention. I'm just a college prof from Kitchener. I don't know, but those are the two arguments. And I actually don't see them as inherently contradicting each other. Each of us begins life living as a single cell weighing about 1/trillionth of a kilogram. Like 1/trillionth of a kilogram is such like a weird number. Right? So like what's a kilogram? Like a pound, 2.1 pounds or 2.4 pounds, I forget. So 1/trillionth of that, like it's like you wouldn't even notice it in your hand, right? Like obviously. This tiny piece of matter, though, contains your entire genetic code. And it's like, that's actually pretty wild. It's pretty wild to think like any piece of your blood contains your entire genetic code, that you were originally one thing. And that genetic code isn't just like a code, it's actually this like instruction manual that orchestrates the growth of this single cell to a person of trillion cells, each single cell within those trillions containing the information from the original cell. Like it's like wild when you really think about it. And I know that you've maybe heard this stuff before, right? But it's like just because we've put names to it doesn't mean it doesn't contain like a magical beauty to it. It's like, this is life. The instruction manual orchestrating this growth from a single cell to a person made of trillions of cells, each containing a replica of the original. That code is carried by our genes. Right? And it's like, I have there that it's our genetic code specifically which prevents us from becoming anything other than humans. And although there's such similarity, right? Like between me and you, our genetic similarity is going to be in the 99 percentile. Right? There's just like that 1% of difference, but that 1% contains a lot of difference. What makes us unique from each other is contained in that 1% difference between us. Right? So you could say, statistically, you could say that 99% of the human genome is identical. Right? And that kind of makes sense that like, especially if you compare us to like a different animal, right? Like this is going to be a weird comparison, but compare us to like, I don't know, a zebra. It's like obviously you and me are way closer together than a zebra and either of us. So it's like we're actually super close, and the difference is in a lot of things like we call personality, and in a lot of things like our memory system and in how we process information is way a bigger difference between us than anything like superficial, like skin color or like eye color or like stuff like that, height. Okay, so I'm not sure why I did it like this. I'm just going to leave this up for you for a second, take a quick coffee break, because for whatever reason I made these claims on the last slide. I had my note like with the wrong slide. So I already said these points, but you might have been scrambling to get it down. So just this idea that each cell houses our entire genetic code, and that code orchestrates. And think of what an orchestra is, right? Like an orchestrate, or like Oh no, it's not called an orchestrate. I just got like made up a word there. The conductor of an orchestra, that's what it's called, not an orchestrate. The conductor stands in front and is like telling, okay, now go with the, obviously it's not like this, and obviously I'm not a conductor, but he's like, violins, cellos, okay, now bring in the, the woodwinds or whatever, and it's like, they're like cueing the different parts, and it's like, that's interesting. Right, because people that study this are trying everything they can do, doing backflips, not to say that it seems like it's intelligent. Because then if it's intelligent, who made it intelligent? Or is it just naturally evolving? Right, because that's what they would like to say. So this is this tension, right? This tension of like, it seems designed, but we don't want to say designed. Right, because intelligent design implies a religious interpretation. Right, whereas, and this is what Darwin struggled with himself. Remember I said that point, it's like, it's not like he wasn't aware of this. It's not like he didn't look at the human eye and have trip out dreams about it being like, I don't know if I'm right. Like, this makes sense for how like different birds' beaks develop, but a human mind, my ability to have this thought, is this just the result of evolution? Interesting thought, right? So each of the nucleus of each human cell contains chromosomes, and these chromosomes are these, I like this word, thread-like structure, like it's like a thread. Like you can look at that picture and see how that looks kind of like twisted up string, right? That like those threads are made up of DNA, right? Those are called chromosomes. Those chromosomes are filled with DNA. DNA is this complex molecule that's in this double helix, right? Which I'll show you in a second, but just looks like the spiral staircase. That's what a double helix is. And that's where the genetic information is. All right? So genes are parts of DNA. That might be like an easy way to write it in your note, is like, if you look at DNA as like this long list of things, and then you look at a certain part of it, that's your genes. Like your genes are a unit of hereditary information. It's a segment, so it's like a piece of hereditary information, like say hair color, the information about hair color. And then all those genes together are like the DNA, right? And that's where you sometimes hear people use, and I think I have this on a future slide, but you'll hear like the human genome, you hear the word genome. And what's genome mean? It's the combination of the word gene and the word chromosome. Genome, chromosome, gene, right? So it's like, it kind of means you're talking about this kind of stuff. You're talking about the actual information inside chromosomes. 23andMe, why is it 23? Well, because there's 23 chromosome pairs. Okay, so, and some of these slides are a little bit, like I wanted to kind of, instead of just hitting you with a lot, I want to show you a picture and then explain it, and show you a picture and then explain it, instead of just giving them all as a list. So genes help to reproduce themselves, and they start to assemble proteins, which is really interesting, because like what protein is, right? Because you think of protein as like an aspect of nutrition, and we don't necessarily think of it as like what's actually building everything, right? The protein in turn is the building blocks of cells, and as well as what regulates and directs all these different body processes, and it's really proteins that are dictating like a lot of your internal processing. Each gene has its own distinguished place on the chromosome, right? So it's like the chromosome, the genes have their own place, right? Which is interesting, because if you're going to map it, right? So what would mapping the human genome mean? It would mean like, okay, we know what the 30th one is and what the 60th one is. And remember I said earlier that we think there's like somewhere in the neighborhood of 23,000 genes in a human, right? So mapping it would mean knowing which ones do what. Here's where you see this double helix idea I was talking about. So like the kind of like looping, another word for double helix would be like a figure eight. A DNA is this complex molecule that has this double helix, spiral staircase kind of look, and that's where the actual information is. So this is like literally in your blood. And I just have the definition up there that like, just that word helix, you'll sometimes hear this double helix. A helix is a shape that's like corkscrew. That's another good word for it. You've all seen like a corkscrew to open a wine bottle, and how it's like intentionally, I don't have to explain how a corkscrew works, but it's obviously like done like that so that when you pull out, there's more friction points, right? But like in this case, it's that same shape, just shape. That's the only comparison to a corkscrew. Okay, Mike, next slide. That got a bit wordy. So I've touched on this before, but I want to hit you with this point that like, okay, so genes are short segments of DNA. We kind of already touched on that. That there's approximately 20,700, right? So I said 23,000 just before, so you might have to correct that. I'm sorry. But that's one of the interesting things, right? That like it keeps getting more specific, and it seems like every time I update the notes, it's like lower, right? So I can remember saying that we thought that there was 100,000, then it was 20, then it was 30,000, then it was 23,000. Now we're thinking that it's probably somewhere in. So sometimes you'll see me in slides say somewhere between 20 and 23,000. Right, the kind of current best estimate I can get for you is like 20,700. Okay, so now here's where it gets complicated, right? Because it's not like some genes do specific things, and sometimes, so like say for example, eye color, or like how straight your hair is, that's like one gene. But like something like intelligence or sense of humor, or like athletic ability, or like wittiness, it's like those are all what's called polygenetic, or just influenced by a bunch of genes. We'll talk about that in a sec. Right, so I have there at the bottom that idea that a genome is that combo of a gene. It's just a word that kind of means it's a combo of the words gene and chromosome. So one scientist thought that humans had approximately 100,000 genes, as I was saying, and one of the big surprises reported by the Human Genome Project was that humans have only about 30,000, and then more recently our number of genes has been revised even further to about 21,000. Right, or 20,700. That's from research by a guy named Fleck. The activity of genes, which is called the genetic expression, is affected by their environment. Okay, so this is going to be an idea we kind of get into over the next little bit, is how your genes, it's like, and that kind of makes sense, right? So it's like your entire, everyone that came before you in your family tree has contributed to the genetic inheritance you have. But then it would make no sense if you pass it on, your life had no effect on that. Right? We're saying everyone that came before you affected it, but except you. It's like obviously your life has an effect on it, right? So your lived experience of that DNA. Like it's wild to think that that DNA actually, like, it's not immortal, but it's. I don't know, that'd be an interesting question. Is DNA immortal? Right, if it's living, it's passed on. The code. I'm thinking like live here, so don't think this is like a prepared rant, because I'm not even sure what I think about that. It's a wild thought, right? It's almost like the code is immortal, but the code itself is not alive. It lives in, but it's sort of chemically alive. It's interesting. I'll get back to you on that. I gotta go on a walk and think about that. For example, hormones that circulate in the blood make their way into the cell, which can turn on or off the genes, right? So like the actual expression of genes is influenced by the hormonal environment of the cell. The flow of hormones can affect the environmental conditions, be affected by environmental conditions, but things like light exposure, right? Light heavily influences all kinds of cellular activity, which makes sense because we've lived in a light-based world for our entire evolution. You heard me make the point earlier that like the interesting question about light is like around light pollution, right? And light pollution just means like the fact that you're exposed to so much artificial light. What effect that has on the brain. And the more interesting question than that is, all of your ancestors at night will go outside and look up, and they would see the heavens, right? What they called the heavens. They'd see like the cosmos, if you'd prefer that word to mean the same thing. And it's like if some of you live in North Bay and you live in a kind of little bit of a rural setting, maybe like you actually do see the night sky. But like in Kitchener, it's like, I live near the auditorium. It's like their baseball lights block out most of the light size, the sun, stars. Like I have a decent backyard, and sometimes when it's really dark, like I can definitely see the Big Dipper, and like I can see some stars. What's the cost to your psychology? What's the cost to your mind? The difference between every night looking up and seeing shooting stars and seeing this gigantic, mind-blowing cosmos, or just looking up and seeing like a kind of two stars and like basically just like a kind of gray, dull sky. That absolutely affects things like depression. Okay, so anyways, forget what I just was, or don't forget what I was saying. Hopefully you found it interesting. I'm 5 minutes in on this slide. I was going to do quick, but like I got going on that light thing. I'll come back to the slide. That one study revealed that an increase in the concentration of the stress hormone cortisol, which you'll hear me talk about a lot, produced a 5-fold increase in DNA damage. Think about that. Which is one of the reasons, you know. And again, it's like some students will like me and some won't, and it's like I'm just gonna be myself, and that's all I can do. But I don't know why I felt like I needed to say that, but I'm gonna show you, and you can't see because the screen's black. But whatever your faith, frequency 528 is the repair frequency for cells damaged DNA. It's like there's your body has a frequency, and it has a frequency when it's in a process of healing. And yeah, we're listening to healing frequencies here while I'm talking, because it, I don't know, puts me in a good vibe. Like it honestly affects my mood, and I don't know, I hope that you don't mind it, and it's better than the computer hum, right? If you don't like it, just remember that if I turn that off, you hear this like zzz the whole time, and that's not fun. I need to get a better production studio here, but you know, we do our best. Another study indicated that sleep deprivation can affect gene expression in such negative ways. So now think about this. So sleep deprivation can affect gene expression in such negative ways as increased inflammation, more expression of stress-related genes, and impairment of protein functioning. Right? So sleep deprivation is another real killer at a genetic level. Right? Because sleep is when the cells basically deal with waste, especially if you're talking about the brain cells. It's the only time they deal with waste. Your brain cells, and we'll talk about this later, but your brain cells are so unique, right? Because your brain cells have blood going to them, but they don't have, there's no lymphatic system in your brain, right? So, but your brain cells obviously produce waste. So when does that waste get removed? And it only gets removed during sleep, which is why if you don't sleep enough, you don't feel fresh mentally. You feel foggy. You are foggy. It's like you haven't been properly. You haven't been through the car wash every night. You know, it's like there's something to be said for that processing that happens when you turn off, sort of. Okay, Mike, you want to talk about 900 things not related to the slide on your... Okay, let's keep moving here. But I hope you like this class. We'll keep working at it. Okay, so in discussing So I like this point. The genes are not only collaborative, they're enduring, right? And this is kind of getting to that point I was saying before. It's not just that like genes combine to create and quite literally orchestrate the development of this new organism. They also endure over time, right? They also pass on across generations. And how do they pass from generation to generation? And how do they end up in these as a trillions of cells in the body, right? And so to discuss this, I'm going to talk about three different things. We're going to talk about mitosis, so basically cell division, and then the cell division specific to the sex cells, and then fertilization. And these three things are like key to this idea of how genetic information passes to the next generation. Okay, so we're going to do slides on each of these things: mitosis, meiosis, and fertilization. So I'm going to show you a video that breaks it down pretty interesting after this, but I want to just kind of give you the words first, right? So mitosis is kind of the easier one, and this just kind of means like splitting the cells, right? So the cell itself duplicates and divides, and this is kind of interesting that like it's not really splitting off, because it's not like it's taking like 50%. It's like actually making a double of itself and then splitting, double of itself, then splitting, double of itself, then splitting. So you see why that double before the split is really important, because what that means is that it's continually putting this, so every cell has that same base code. The two new cells are formed, and each contains the same DNA as the original, arranged in the same 23 pairs. And this cell duplication, or this cell proliferation or expansion or increase in numbers, however you want to say it, this basically doubling, poof, doubling, so it goes like 1 to 2 to 4 to 16 to whatever, 32 or whatever, and it just keeps 2, 2, 2, 2, 2 until there's trillions of them, right? And that's how basically how cell division works for everything except the sex chromosome. Okay, so if there's 23 chromosomes, this is describing 22 of them. Okay, so now let's go to the meiosis. Okay, so meiosis has to do with the gametes, right? So the gametes are the sperm and the egg. A cell of the testes or ovaries duplicate its chromosomes, but then divides twice, thus forming 4, each which contains only half of the information, right? So it's a different kind of duplication, and it's only copying half. It's almost preparing it to be mixed. By the end of meiosis, each pair has unpaired. So you see how it's like ready to then match with the other one. So I'm going to show you a video that explains this in just a second, but I wanted to make this kind of clear point that like there's basically mitosis that explains how cells duplicate in general, and then meiosis is specific to the sex chromosome. It's specific to the material coming from the testes and ovaries. So let me show you this in like a video that kind of breaks it down a bit.
Before we go in depth on meiosis, I want to do a very high-level overview comparing mitosis to meiosis. So in mitosis, and this is all a review if you've watched the mitosis video, in mitosis we start with a cell. We start with a cell that has a diploid number of chromosomes. I'll just write 2n to show it has the diploid number. For human beings, this would be 46 chromosomes. 46 for 46 for humans. You get 23 chromosomes from your mother, 23 chromosomes from your father, or you could say you have 23 homologous pairs, which leads to 46 chromosomes. Now, after the process of mitosis happens, and you have your cytokinesis and all the rest, you end up with 2 cells that each have the same genetic information as the original. So you now have 2 cells that each have the diploid number of chromosomes. So 2n and 2n. And now each of these cells are just like this cell was. It can go through interphase again, and it grows, and it can replicate its DNA and its centrosomes and grow some more. And then each of these can go through mitosis again. And this is actually how most of the cells in your body grow. This is how you turn from a single cell organism into you, or for the most part, into you. So that is mitosis. And one way to think about it, it's a cycle. After each of these things go through mitosis, they can then go through the entire cell cycle again. And let me write this a little bit neater. Mitosis. That S was a little bit hard to read. Now, what happens in meiosis? What happens in meiosis? I'll do that over here. In meiosis, something slightly different happens. And it happens in two phases. So you will start with a cell that has a diploid number of chromosomes. So you will start with a cell that has a diploid number of chromosomes. And in its interphase, it also replicates its DNA. And then it goes through something called meiosis 1. And in meiosis 1, what you end up with is two cells that now have a haploid number of chromosomes. So you end up with two cells. You now have two cells that each have a haploid number of chromosomes. So you have N and you have N. So if we're talking about human beings, you have 46 chromosomes here, and now you have 23 chromosomes in this nucleus, and now you have 23 in this nucleus, but you're still not done. Then each of these will then go through a phase, which I'll talk about in a second, which is very similar to mitosis, which will duplicate this entire cell into two. So actually, let me do it like this. So now this one, you're going to have four cells that each have the haploid number of chromosomes. And they all don't necessarily have the same genetic information anymore. Because as we go through this first phase right over here of meiosis, and this first phase where you go from diploid to haploid, right over here, this is called meiosis 1. Meiosis 1. You're essentially splitting the homologous pairs, and so this one might get some of the ones that you originally got from your father, and some of the ones that you originally got from your mother, some of the ones that you originally got from your father, some of the ones that you originally got from your mother. They split randomly, but each homologous pair gets split up, and then in this phase, meiosis 2. So this phase right over here is called meiosis 2. It's very similar to mitosis, except you're now dealing with cells that start off with the haploid number. And it's important to realize meiosis is not a cycle. These cells that you have over here, these are gametes. These are sex cells. These are gametes. These can now be used in fertilization. If we're talking about if you're male, this is happening in your testes, and these are going to be sperm cells. If you are female, this is happening in your ovaries, and these are going to be egg cells. If you are a tree, this could be pollen, or it could be an ovule. So these are used for fertilization. These will fuse together in sexual reproduction to get to a fertilized egg, which then can undergo mitosis to create an entirely new organism. So not a cycle here, although I guess once these will find sex cells from another organism and fuse with them, and then those can turn into another organism, and I guess the whole circle of life starts again. But it's not the case with mitosis, where this could just keep on going and going and going. This cell is just like this cell, while these sex cells are different than this one right over here. Now, where does this happen in the body? And we've talked about this in previous videos. These are your somatic cells right over here. These are the ones that make up the bulk of your body, somatic cells. And where is this happening? Well, this is happening in germ cells. As we mentioned, if you're male, it's in your testes, and if you're female, it's in your ovaries. And germ cells actually can undergo mitosis to produce other germ cells that have a diploid number of chromosomes, or they can undergo meiosis in order to produce sperm or egg cells, in order to produce gametes.
So here's a kind of interesting point, right? So we call this a zygote, right? A zygote. This basically when the egg has entered the sperm has entered the egg. The egg and sperm each contribute about 23% or 23 unpaired chromosomes to form the 23 paired chromosomes. Right, so one interesting point is that chromosomes in the zygote are not exact copies of those in the mother's ovaries and those in the father's testes. And this is interesting, like exact copies. The language is important because when, say, information is copied from dad to the baby or from mom to the baby, if there's an error in that copying, since it's not like a photocopy, it's like a recreation of it. There's it's almost like copying error. It's like cut and paste. It's like they're losing something before you press paste. And when there's an error in how it's copied, that's called a mutation, right? So a mutation is when there's a copying error. Copying error and mutation are the same word, sort of, right? So, and a lot of mutations are small little things, and most of them are negative. Some of them can be neutral or positive, like say like blue eyes or red hair are mutations, but most mutations are linked with health issues, or lots, I should say. Okay, so before the two separate, pieces of the two chromosomes are in each pair exchange, creating a new combination of genes on each chromosome. Another source of variability comes from the DNA. Chance events, a mistake by the cellular machinery, or damage caused by some kind of external environment like radiation, can produce a mutated gene, a permanently altered segment of DNA.
In this video then we'll look at the beginning of development, looking into the ovary at an unfertilized egg. It then gets fertilized by sperm which travel down the fallopian tube. So here millions of sperm coming along. Several of them will hit the egg and try to penetrate it, but one will win, as it were, go into the nucleus, and then there's a reprogramming process where the male and female nuclei have their genes set aside to be turned on and off for early development. Here you see early cleavage stages occurring, and this is one of the early growth phases. As the embryo moves down the fallopian tube, it's going to form an important stage called the blastocyst here in a few seconds. Of course, in real life that takes days, about 5 days. At this stage, then, I'd like to draw your attention to the inside of the blastocyst, where there are cells called the inner cell mass, which I'll be abbreviating as ICM. Those are the cells that make the entire animal. And the outer cells give rise to the placenta and other supporting tissues. At this stage, the embryo implants into the wall of the uterus. This is when a pregnancy is really initiated. And now we'll see those blue inner cell mass cells form a disc, and then as the cells continue to grow, they change their physical positions, their kind of geographical relationship to one another. And you'll see that represented here as this disc gets transformed into an embryo. Those lines represent sites where cells are migrating in and out. And here's an important stage when the three beginning layers of the embryo, the so-called germ layers, are formed, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. As development proceeds, there's more growth and movement of cells. It'll begin to form a neural tube. Here it turns, and appendages start to bud out. You see the head forming and the eye. And then eventually we get a small embryo, and some months later, of course, this would be born as a young baby.
Oh, hi there. Okay, where were we? I don't know. Tried to do a different kind of intro. We're getting deep into the presentation now. Trying to keep the energy there. I want to distinguish between the difference here between a genotype and a phenotype. Okay, so think about it as the genotype is like the code, and the phenotype's like what the code does. The difference between a genotype and a phenotype can help us understand the source of variability, right? Why people are so different, and all of a person's genetic material makes up their genotype. It's the code. It's the code that's uniquely specific to you. I have here written, there's an increasing interest in the subject of susceptibility, right? Like how certain people are more susceptible or more likely to have problems with certain things, right? Like whether you're talking about like an allergy or whatever. So susceptibility genes, those that make an individual more vulnerable to a specific disease or accelerant, like maybe it's in the positive direction, like towards longevity, those that make individuals less vulnerable to certain diseases and more likely to live to an older age. These are aspects of the genotype. A phenotype is sort of the expression of that, right? So you'd have in your genotype, there'd be the information. It's like the code. It's like literally, it's weird when we talk about what DNA code means, because we're really talking about like chemical messages, right? Like DNA is literally like these chemicals that are in a certain sequence, right? And that sequence is kind of the code, and the code is actually the sequence and also what you would label each of the liquids, right? And you'll see like sometimes it's like A, T, C, they name it by the chemical name, and it's like, it's actually pretty interesting that this is like, because it's so wild, right? When you stop and think for a sec that like we're really talking about like a chemical signaling mechanism that's in your blood that's so small that there's like 23,000, it's like, or 21,700, whatever, it's like, or 20,700, I mean, it's like pretty interesting how it's so complex. And to just stay with this definition, so a genotype's like the code, the phenotype's like the expression of the code, the observable characteristic, the hair, right? I'll use that as the example, the male pattern baldness, whatever, right? It's like there's a genome on my gene with that, you know, I clearly got from my dad's side, but the phenotype is like what you actually see, the observable characteristics, including physical characteristics, right? But also including like some more psychological characteristics like personality and intelligence. For a genotype, and see that gets complicated, because you're like, well, what's the genes for those things, personality and intelligence? And that's super complicated, but intelligence in that is going to be influenced by a whole bunch of genes, and we're going to call that polygenetic, or just multiple genes. Yeah, for example, a genotype, for each genotype there's a range of things that can be expressed, right? So there's a genotype for like hair color, and there's different types of phenotypes, right? Like dark hair, red hair, brown hair, blonde hair, whatever. So like, I think the easiest way to think about it is like the genotype's like the actual code, and the phenotype is like what the code does. An individual can inherit a genetic potential to grow very large, for example, but good nutrition, amongst other things, is essential for achieving that potential, right? So like someone could grow with the predisposition to be tall because they come from a long line of tall people or whatever, but if they don't have proper nutrition, they could fail to meet that. So it's like a predisposition, it's not a cause-effect. So another important term to look at here is this idea of like what dominant and recessive means, right? So if you basically picture it like this, like say mom and dad, mom has blue eyes and dad has brown eyes, and when that's the case, almost always the brown eyes wins, right? Or the brown eyes wins. I'm doing my directions weird because the mirrors flip them up and down, but anyways, the idea is that like when the two square off, one tends to always win. So much so, not always, but one tends to win a higher percentage of the time, a dominant percentage of the time, right? So let's say like 9 out of 10 times, if blue and brown eyes are present at the same time, the coding will pass for brown. And that's what that means, is that it's not just like 50-50, right? It's like one's more likely to be than the other. One's dominant and one's recessive. One gene characteristic in a chromosome pair dominates passing on its gene while the other is recessive. Most mutant genes are recessive, right? And again, this is where if we were alive, I'd make my joke about like how when people see the word mutant, they always think of like Ninja Turtles or X-Men, but it's like a mutation is just a copying error, right? When a gene's not copied correctly, and that's, now think about it, that's really interesting, right? So say like blue eyes is that, well, blue eyes is complicated too, because there's a Neanderthal component to that. That's maybe a topic for a different day. But same with red hair. But in this scenario, right, it's like it's the pattern, it's the dominant pattern, means that like the majority of the time it wins out. And the point I was going to make there about mutant genes that's interesting is that it seems like an interesting, almost safety check and balance mechanism of life, that things that are like these random changes tend to then, when that random change information like red hair or blue eyes comes against something that's more hardwired, like the green eyes or blue or brown eyes, that the new mutation or whatever tends to lose, tends to be recessive. That was more clear if you weren't watching my hands. I didn't do a great job visually depicting that, but better job on the screen there. So that word allele is like a variant of the gene, right? So there's an allele for blue eyes or brown eyes or green eyes. It's one of two or more variations of a known mutation on a certain part of a chromosome. Because to a certain part, like almost every, see, like when you say like blue eyes is a mutation and red hair is a mutation, it's like, what are you really saying? Because like most things are at some point a mutation, right? It's just how far back you're going. It's like recent mutation is maybe a better way to talk about red hair and blue eyes. But again, it's like there's also a Neanderthal DNA component to that for a lot of Northwestern Europeans. Okay, so in terms of the difference between male and female, that's found on the 23rd chromosome, right? So the 23rd chromosome is where if there's two X's, it's a woman, right? And if it's an X and a Y, it's male. And that's always on the 23rd chromosome. So sort of interesting, right? I made the comment earlier, that's why it's called 23andMe. These 23 chromosomes in the DNA that exist within these pairs, right? So it's 46 chromosomes, 23 pairs, obviously 23 times 2 is 46. So sometimes you hear it said the different ways, 46 or 23. Okay, so the sex difference in mammals, or in life, is found on the 23rd chromosome. Okay, I'm just gonna keep my picture off for this slide too, just because it kind of gets in the way of the image I have there. That what we realize is that as our understanding of genetics has gotten stronger and stronger, and since we're talking about humans that are such a complex organism, like we realize that a lot of the changes that happen, or a lot of the, sorry, I meant to say a lot of the things that influence things, so a lot of the genes that influence complex things are actually multiple genes influencing it, right? And you heard me a couple slides ago say the word polygenetic. So this is what we're talking about here. Inheritance, you already know what that means, right? You inherit certain biology from your parents and from everyone that comes before you in your family tree. So polygenetic just means, well, sometimes what influences a single trait, like skin color is an example of a physical characteristic, intelligence, things like that, it's actually multiple genes. Right? There's not a ton of things that are influenced by only one gene or a pair of genes. Usually it's this polygenetic determinism or whatever. Sometimes you hear it called that. So it says there, however, in the 20th century, people were well aware that most traits are too complex to be determined by a single gene. This is the idea of polygenetic inheritance. And that probably makes sense to you, right? That it's kind of a little easier for, like, it's easier for our minds to think of like hair color being controlled by something relatively simple, or like whether or not you have freckles being controlled by something relatively simple. But like your intelligence or your sense of humor being a more, the correct word would be polygenetic source, right? It's a more polygenetic source. So if I ask you, like, what's the first thing you think of when you see the two gentlemen on the screen? It's like what you'll probably say is like, is that two guys, or is that like, you know, almost like a Photoshop? They look so similar, and identical twins are very interesting, and they're super interesting from a developmental psychology perspective, especially for the conversation of nature versus nurture, right? Because it's as close as you're going to ever get to humans on the nature point. So then it introduces a lot of very fascinating discussions around nurture. This field studies the influence of heredity and environment. Oh yeah, so sorry. So I was going to make this point that like the Minnesota twin studies, which I'm going to talk about in a second, were really interesting because they basically at University of Minnesota, they paid to have all these groups of identical twins from around the world come in, and they did all these studies, right? And they found some really interesting things, and some of the things they found were suggestive of this idea that maybe some of our genetic inheritance affects behavior. Because like what they found is that like these people, that even if they were separated at birth, it was a lot of work to arrange a study like this, you can imagine, and it was a very well funded study. It's interesting that like the Minnesota Twins baseball team predates this, but it is interesting and kind of weird. It almost, you could see how it could have been the opposite. Like the Minnesota University's most famous study was about twins, and that's also what their team name is. But that's because there's twin cities, right, of Minnesota and St. Paul, I think, or something like that. Anyways, the thing I was trying to say there is just that what they were noticing is that like some of maybe what's inherited is behavioral, which is like really wild, right? Like it's easier for you to probably understand, like the average person to get the idea that like I inherited baldness from my dad. It'd be a more of a stretch of the mind to say I inherited like his slap shot, or like his ability to play sports, or like a sense of humor, like something that's like more complicated, more behavioral, and more like applied, kind of less of just like a physical characteristic. Yeah, like human traits. Okay, so we're going to look at this kind of interesting example of the Minnesota twin studies. So this is the work of Nancy Siegel. Actually, sorry, the book is her book on this landmark Minnesota twin study, right? On this, she wrote up on it. Thomas Bouchard's the person that ran the actual study. I'll talk about him in just a second. But look at the title there, right? It's like the title is really interesting. Born together, reared apart. Reared means raised, right? Or like, yeah, raised. So reared means child rearing, means child raising. Rearing actually kind of means training. So like, think about, it's basically like nature together, nurture apart. And so this is one of the things that was so interesting about the Minnesota twin studies. I'm going to read you a little bit here. In 1979, researchers led by Thomas Bouchard at the University of Minnesota invited genetically identical twins from all over the world who had been separated at birth to Minnesota. To discover their similarities and differences in characteristics and personality, intelligence, and behavior, the participating twins collected personality and intelligence tests, provided detailed medical histories, were asked questions about their family and childhood, personal interests, academic abilities, family lives, vocation orientation, so work, values, aesthetic judgments. And the examples that they found were pretty awesome. I have one written down here I want to show you. One striking example is the Jim twins, Jim Springer and Jim Lewis. They were separated at 4 weeks of age, didn't see each other again until they were 39. So think about that. These two kids were born. They were separated when they were only 4 weeks old, so they would have had little to no concept of each other, especially if they were in a maternity ward in different cribs. And then they didn't see each other again until 39. So I'm just kind of making that point so that you can kind of see that, like, it's a pretty easy argument to make that they had different upbringings, right? So even though they were genetically from the same egg, not only did their adoptive parents both for some reason name them Jim, but both of them had dogs named Toy. They both married and then divorced a woman named Betsy, different Betsy. Amazingly too, one of the Jims named his son James Allen, and the other one named their son James Allen, and the one Allen has 2 L's and the other one doesn't. That's the only difference. So like think about that, and then I have next, like, well, one could debate the coincidence in such a story. It's hard to argue that like genes would have played no part in that. The genes sing a, this is kind of poetic line I took from their thing. I thought this was awesome. The genes sing a prehistoric song that today should sometimes be resisted, but which would be foolish to ignore. Bouchard and others, 1990. I'll say it again because it's awesome if you get that whole thing. It's a prehistoric song that should be sometimes resisted but not ignored. The genes play a prehistoric song that sometimes today should be resisted but would be foolish to ignore. That's how you ruin a good quote. I said it like 4 times, but it doesn't mean we have to bow to our genes, but we need to integrate them. So I have the next slide I'm going to show you is a cool video that explains this epigenetics idea, but like the simplest way to say epigenetics is that like the environment influences genetics, right? That you're born, I'm born, I have DNA. My DNA has been influenced by my experience. I've had 2 kids. So if we say that like the DNA that I've passed on to my children, it'd be silly to say that everything in my family tree influences it except me. Right? Obviously I do, but then that brings in another whole series of questions and like, okay, well, what are we actually saying? That like your lived experience shapes your genetics, and we know that's true with like mice. Like you can stress out mice and then have them have babies, and you can find higher base levels of cortisol in baby mice. So like so this is the idea, right? Like how much does the world influence the gene? Epigenetics is the study of changes in an organism caused by modification of gene expression rather than the actual code itself, right? So like you have your gene code, but how that code plays out can be influenced by things in your environment, right? Like how stressful it is, if there's certain pollutants, if there's a lack of stimulation. Yeah, so like it can affect how the proteins actually produce and influence different processes in the body. Right? So it's kind of wild. It's almost like saying your lived experience doesn't affect the actual code of your DNA, but it affects how it gets expressed. Right, because to affect the actual code, then we're talking about when it then gets copied to the next kid. So we're going back in the cycle again. So I hope you find this kind of interesting, and it's like, I'm not going to like quiz you super hard on explaining what epigenetics is, but like I want you to just have this point that it's interesting. It's not like you're just born in this biologically determined way. You're born with like a biological resource kit full of potential that certain things get emphasized based on environmental fit. It's like, again, I almost said it's a brilliant design, but this has been the problem of, again, this language between evolution and design, right? Which is somewhat, again, I've made my point a few times on this, and I won't say it a million times, but it's somewhat a theoretical difference, right? Like it could be both. It's hard to not see an intelligence in it. It's so much more complicated than we think, too. And it's like, just because we give words and make up a word like epigenetic, that means like, oh, that means how the environment affects your genes. And it's like, yeah, okay, well, what exactly do you mean? Because that's a pretty wild idea. It's like that example of cortisol affecting the stress levels of the baby mouse is a good example of what it actually means.
Here's a conundrum. Identical twins originate from the same DNA, so how can they turn out so different, even in traits that have a significant genetic component? For instance, why might one twin get heart disease at 55 while her sister runs marathons in perfect health? Nature versus nurture has a lot to do with it, but a deeper related answer can be found within something called epigenetics. That's the study of how DNA interacts with the multitude of smaller molecules found within cells, which can activate and deactivate genes. If you think of DNA as a recipe book, those molecules are largely what determine what gets cooked when. They aren't making any conscious choices themselves. Rather, their presence and concentration within cells makes the difference. So how does that work? Genes in DNA are expressed when they're read and transcribed into RNA, which is translated into proteins by structures called ribosomes. And proteins are much of what determines a cell's characteristics and function. Epigenetic changes can boost or interfere with the transcription of specific genes. The most common way interference happens is that DNA, or the proteins it's wrapped around, gets labeled with small chemical tags. The set of all of the chemical tags that are attached to the genome of a given cell is called the epigenome. Some of these, like a methyl group, inhibit gene expression by derailing the cellular transcription machinery or causing the DNA to coil more tightly, making it inaccessible. The gene is still there, but it's silent. Boosting transcription is essentially the opposite. Some chemical tags will unwind the DNA, making it easier to transcribe, which ramps up production of the associated protein. Epigenetic changes can survive cell division, which means that they could affect an organism for its entire life. Sometimes that's a good thing. Epigenetic changes are part of normal development. The cells in an embryo start with one master genome. As the cells divide, some genes are activated and others inhibited. Over time, through this epigenetic reprogramming, some cells develop into heart cells and others into liver cells. Each of the approximately 200 cell types in your body has essentially the same genome, but its own distinct epigenome. The epigenome also mediates a lifelong dialogue between genes and the environment. The chemical tags that turn genes on and off can be influenced by factors including diet, chemical exposure, and medication. The resulting epigenetic changes can eventually lead to disease if, for example, they turn off a gene that makes a tumor-suppressing protein. Environmentally induced epigenetic changes are part of the reason why genetically identical twins can grow up to have very different lives. As twins get older, their epigenomes diverge, affecting the way they age and their susceptibility to disease. Even social experiences can cause epigenetic changes. In one famous experiment, when mother rats weren't attentive enough to their pups, genes in the babies that help them manage stress were methylated and turned off. And it might not stop with that generation. Most epigenetic marks are erased when egg and sperm cells are formed. But now, researchers think that some of those imprints survive, passing those epigenetic traits on to the next generation. Your mother's or your father's experiences as a child or choices as adults could actually shape your own epigenome. But even though epigenetic changes are sticky, they're not necessarily permanent. A balanced lifestyle that includes a healthy diet, exercise, and avoiding exposure to contaminants may, in the long run, create a healthy epigenome. It's an exciting time to be studying this. Scientists are just beginning to understand how epigenetics could explain mechanisms of human development and aging, as well as the origins of cancer, heart disease, mental illness, addiction, and many other conditions. Meanwhile, new genome editing techniques are making it much easier to identify which epigenetic changes really matter for health and disease. Once we understand how our epigenome influences us, we might be able to influence it too.
So I know that you have heard this stuff before, but we're just going to go over this in detail a little bit. That like conception occurs when a single sperm cell from a male unites with an ovum in the female's fallopian tube in a process called fertilization. Right? Over the next few months, the genetic code directs a series of changes in that fertilized egg, but many events and hazards will influence how that egg becomes and develops into a person. Right? So while that baby is developing in the womb, there's different stages that are more sensitive and critical, right? And it's like, I think I already talked about in this class how ethanol passes through the placenta, and that's why like drinking is like dangerous. And in reality, it's more dangerous at sometimes than others, but that's a dangerous idea to play with because it's like a lot of times a woman's not completely sure. Like it's not that hard of a science. It's not that specific of a science that we can be like for sure that this is a safe time, basically, is what I'm trying to say. Yet during the 3 semesters of pregnancy, genetic code directs a series of changes in this fertilized egg. And this is where I'm saying it's like you think of a better word than intelligence. Like it's hard to think of, okay, so it's like the baby's born and the information in the egg already has the information in it to direct all these developmental changes that eventually lead to you. It's like, we're letting the word code do a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence, right? We're just saying it's just code. It's just code. Like, it's like that's what I'm trying to challenge you with is like, how wild is that thought? Like, think of what that really means. That there's like a code that obviously isn't thinking for itself. It's like some kind of, well, it's literally a chemical messenger. Which again, we have that word, but like a chemical messenger, that's a wild thought too. A chemical that holds information, the most core information to your being. So sometimes I wanted to just make a quick point on this, that like sometimes you'll hear the word trimester. It's actually kind of confusing because sometimes you'll hear it used differently, right? Sometimes you'll hear people use because trimester just means something broken into 3 parts, right? Like a semester is 2. No, a semester is 1. Or whatever, it doesn't matter. I'm messing myself up trying to think through like Latin where it's coming from. But anyways, just the word trimester means 3 stages, right? And so some people can say, sometimes you'll hear people say first, second, and third trimester in terms of Now that's basically by calendar months, right? So if you look at a pregnancy as being 9 months, it's like the first, the second, and the third. But like, if you're looking at how the baby's developing, we're actually looking at this idea of like the germinal, the embryonic, and the fetal. Okay, so that's what we're going to be talking about here. So these are and the reason I'm saying that is because those aren't all like 3 months, 3 months. Like the germinal period is way shorter. They're not an equal amount of calendar time. Okay, so to just kind of continue that last point. So this is what is called a zygote. A zygote. Those are all the different pronunciations you hear. I can probably throw a few more. It's like I've said that word a bunch of times, and I still think I say it like with a slightly different way every time. But it means this stage, right? It means this stage. It means when you've basically gotten to 4 weeks. By the time you get to 4 weeks, there's a spinal cord, there's a nervous system, there's a lungs, there's a whole gastrointestinal system, there's a heart, there's beginning of a neural tube, right? There's the tissues of the body are all there. Still less than 0.25 centimeters. This rapid cell division begins in the germinal period. Within a week after conception, the cells start to differentiate, do different things. They start to do their specialized different tasks. At this stage, an organism, which is now called a blightocyst, which you saw in that one video a while ago, when it's like basically when the blightocyst gets like embedded in the wall, it's basically when we consider like a female pregnant. At this stage, the organism, now called the blightocyst, consists of a hollow ball of cells that will eventually develop into the embryo, right? And then the thoroblast, which is the outer layer of cells. So that's like so wild too. It's like two things, right? It's basically like what's growing in the inside, and then the outer layer is like what's going to support what's growing, right? Which eventually is like the placenta and all that stuff for a human. But like, how wild is that? Like, it's not just the thing growing; it's the thing growing with the environment, the initial environment it needs for growth. Right? And the implantation of that blastocyst in the uterine wall takes place during week 2. Okay, so see why I was saying this before is that like this is time-wise, this is only like the first 4 weeks out of the 9 months. So the next period, the embryonic period, right, where it's an embryo, developing embryo, it's like this is like a 16-week period, right? So basically like 4 months. By the end of this period, the baby's got some significant size. The skin's still transparent though, right? Because the skin's one of the organs that's developing. They got this like kind of fur, not fur, I shouldn't say fur, but like what used to be fur and evolutionarily, but this like downy hair, they say, just like a light hair, like fingernails, toenails are starting to form. The baby's starting to move around. This occurs from 2 to 8 weeks after conception. During this embryonic period, the rate of cell differentiation, so cells doing different things, intensifies. Support systems for cells form. The organs start to develop. The mass of cells is now called an embryo. 3 layers of cell. The embryo's endoderm, which there's a video that you've either already seen or will see that shows this. The endoderm is the inner layer of cells, which will develop into body parts such as the digestive system and the respiratory system. The exoderm is the outermost layer, and that'll be sensory receptors, like this is so wild in skin. So it's basically going to be the eyes, ears, nose, hair, nails. And then the mesoderm, the middle layer, which is going to be the internal areas, which will be the circulatory system, the bone system, the excretory system, so like your intestines, and the reproductive system. This process of organ formation is called organogenesis. So it's interesting, right? Genesis, like the Bible word meaning like beginning. Organogenesis, so like the beginning of organs. While they're being formed, organs are very vulnerable to their environment, right? So think about that. Like one of the reasons why pregnancy is such like a delicate time for the developing embryo is because they're literally creating their organs. So while those things are being created, it's a very sensitive environment. Right, as the embryo's 3 layers form, its life support system develops rapidly. These systems include the umbilical cord and the placenta. Right, the umbilical cord, which typically contains 2 arteries and 1 vein, connects the baby to the placenta. The placenta, this you don't have to have this all written down. The placenta, this disc-shaped group of tissues in which the small blood vessels from the mom and the offspring intertwine but do not join. It's like the meeting place between mom and baby. Very small molecules, however, can pass through, such as oxygen, water, salt, and nutrients from the mom's blood, as well as carbon dioxide and digestive waste from the babies back into the mom. See, that's so wild too, right? It's like the baby obviously goes to the washroom, that gets into the placenta, eventually gets into mom's system and gets handled that way. Larger molecules can't pass through the wall, right? So just one more point on this. This is why alcohol is dangerous to the baby, as ethanol has been experimentally shown to cross through the human placenta barrier. It's important to note that the mechanisms that govern the transfer of substances across that barrier are complex and even today not fully understood, right? That's why I was kind of given that hesitation before. Even today not fully understood, the placenta. It's like amazing, really. Like, it's like the sac in which life grows, right? And then the vast majority of the pregnancy time, right, like, is this fetal period, the period that extends from 2 months after conception, so it's from the end of the embryonic period till like birth. Okay, so at this point, in addition to they say like, yeah, people also use the words trimesters, right, instead of these. This is very much talking about it in a different way of looking at trimesters. I already made this point before about how it's not different than the calendar. This is looking at it in developmental stages, right? And at this third trimester, where we see the fetus or this fetal period, right, we're seeing the baby add lots of size, starting to do the behaviors around rudimentary or basic breathing, starting to get really active, especially near the end of the period, starting to add a lot of body fat, getting ready to meet the world. So as you can probably imagine, what interests us the most in a class like this is what's going on inside the brain, right? So that thing that just got highlighted there, took me a while to figure out how to do that, was is the neural tube, right? So think of what the neural tube means. It means that there's this group of neurons that are starting to specialize, right? It's going to become the brain. By the time a baby's born, they have approximately 100 billion neurons, which handle processing information at a cell level in the brain. Right? As the human as the human embryo develops inside a mother's womb, the nervous system begins forming a long, hollow tube located in the embryo's back. This pear-shaped, see how it looks like an upside-down pear, neural tube, which forms at about 18 to 24 days after conception, develops out of the exoderm, which we talked about just a second ago. The tube closes at the top and bottom at about 24 days after conception. You could consider that the start of the brain. So my point here, right, is that, like, okay, if we're looking at this from the perspective of what we care about in terms of brain development while baby's still in womb, it's like, well, number one, development of the neural tube. Number two, neurogenesis. Okay, so what neurogenesis is this idea of, like, well, again, I just recently, we were talking about organogenesis, and I was talking about the word genesis, right? Genesis meaning the beginning of neurons, the creation of new neurons. The production of new neurons is called neurogenesis. At the peak of neurogenesis, it's estimated that as many as 200,000 neurons are being generated per minute. At approximately 6 to 24 weeks after conception, this neural migration starts to occur. Okay, I'm going to talk about that on the next slide. So this step 2 is, number 1, you get the neural tube. Number 2, you start getting this expansion in the amount of these brain cells. Right, and it's happening in other areas too, but we're just looking at the brain now for a second. Neurogenesis, new neurons being created. So then this idea, which is kind of interesting, this third idea, which is called neural migration, right? I thought that was going to come out as one, but migration, think of that as moving from one place to another. Neural migration meaning just like these brain cells moving from one spot to the other. It's like moving to different areas of the brain to specialize, right? Because different parts of your brain do different things. It's kind of wild to think how that developed into that, and it developed into that by all these, having the neural tube and then having it overproduce more and more, and then having those starting to do their own thing, spreading out over the brain. neuromigration, this mass movement of neurons from the germinal zone where they're being produced to where they're going. And sometimes, and these are just like fancy words that just mean sometimes it goes forward, sometimes sideways, sometimes on an angle, right? Radially straight, tangentially is like across then out or whatever, and then like diagonally, it just means like different directions basically.
In the last module, we took first steps towards understanding the electrical properties of individual neurons. We learned how electrical forces and diffusion give rise to membrane potentials, and we learned how cells can generate and propagate signals called action potentials, or spikes, along the membrane. Understanding the properties of the neuronal membrane is essential, but understanding just these properties isn't sufficient to give us insight into collective behavior of the billions of connected neurons in our brains. Luckily for us, we can approach neuroscience at many different scales and levels of analysis, and we don't have to confront the full complexity of everything all at once. That's what we'll be exploring throughout the rest of this course as we slowly go from our understanding of single molecules, such as ion channels, to the electrical behavior of neurons, to their collective behavior in small circuits, and finally onto how they become organized in large functional regions of the brain. Let's start simple though. Since we've examined one neuron, a logical next question is how do two neurons connect with one another? We'll first examine some basic cellular anatomy of neurons. So far, we haven't made too much of the fact that the majority of neurons are polarized cells. That is, they have one portion of the cell for receiving inputs and another portion for sending outputs. The parts of the cells that are specialized for receiving inputs from other cells are called dendrites. The word dendrite comes from the Greek word dendron, meaning tree, and as you can see, the dendrites have a branching, tree-like structure. A signal received by a dendrite is passed to the cell body. If there is sufficient depolarization of the cell body membrane to initiate an action potential, then an action potential is sent down the axon. The axon then carries the propagating action potential to another neuron. So what actually happens at the boundary between two neurons, between the axon of one neuron and the dendrite of another? This interface is called a synapse. There are two general types of synapses: electrical synapses and chemical synapses. Electrical synapses are less common in our own nervous systems, but they're simpler to think about, so let's start with them. Electrical synapses are basically pores between two cells that allow ions to pass through. They allow the passage of the electrical signal through to a neighboring cell without much fuss. It's not so different than just combining two cells into one larger cell. There are lots of reasons that nature might need synapses like this from time to time. They're fast and they allow cells to couple together with a high degree of synchronicity. But most neurons are connected together by a much more complicated structure called a chemical synapse. In a chemical synapse, rather than simply passing along an electrical signal from one cell to another, the action potential travels to the end of the axon and causes a chemical to be released into a very small space between the two neurons called the synaptic cleft. This chemical is taken up by the downstream neuron on the other side of the cleft. This chemical signal can cause the downstream neuron to depolarize its membrane, converting the chemical signal back into an electrical one. Or it can have other effects on the cell. This chemical step is slower than transmission across an electrical synapse, but it opens up an enormously diverse repertoire of different and more complex kinds of signaling. And synaptic function plays a critical role in computations performed by neurons. We'll spend the rest of this unit exploring the inner workings of chemical synapses, on our way to beginning to look at how networks of interconnected neurons give rise to behavior. We'll also look at the role of defective synaptic physiology in neurological and psychiatric disorders, and we'll see how synapses can be targeted by various psychoactive drugs and poisons. Finally, we'll wrap up by looking at how synapses can change over time in response to external stimuli, playing a foundational role in how we learn and remember.
So I thought that last video was pretty sweet about how the neurons work and stuff, like what a synapsis is, because it's like that's the wild thing to think of humans is like our brain is mainly chemical synapses, but there are some electrical, right? There is, and we're in a lot of organisms they're primarily electrical. It's like a chemical message allows for more variability, right? Because the chemicals could be different. It's almost like you could have a pop machine that only ever gives Pepsi, or you could have a pop machine that could give a variety of flavors depending on the situation. It's like the electrical connections are fast and they're hardwired, but they're somewhat simplistic compared to chemical connections. And so this neural connectivity just means that you're having all this like dendrites and axons, like you just said, branches and senders, basically, receivers and senders. That in this connection, you can almost think of it as a wiring diagram. This word is called, like the connections in your brain, it's called a connectome. It's just like the word connect and then OME at the end. It's a comprehensive map of the connections in the brain. So it's like if we could say that like this part of your brain is connected to this, and this is connected to this, and this, and this, and this is connected to this, and this, but not that, but this is this. It's like if we could map all that out. A connectome would include the mapping of all your neural connections within your nervous system. So that's pretty neat. So that's kind of my point. Okay, so if we're looking at the brain development during this period in the womb, we're looking at the development of the neural tube, number one. Number two, we're looking at the neurogenesis. Number three, neural migration and moving around. And number four, then everything connecting, neural connectivity, how it plugs in. Sorry, this has been a pretty long presentation, but this is my last slide, and then I'm just going to do a couple, read some review. Okay, but I wanted to show you this app card because when a baby's born, then the nurse will apply this app card. And it's not like the nurse has a clipboard to do it. She's probably doing it in her head. And she's just basically looking for these 5 things. Like, is the baby showing some activity, right? And if the baby's not, if there's zeros on any of these are massive panic points, right? And what you're looking for right away. Right? Is the baby responding? Is the baby showing a pulse? Is the baby grimacing like they should be not liking if they're getting pricked on the foot? Does the baby have a what's the apparent appearance of the baby, right? Like, and then it's starting from like worst to best. Like does the baby look blue or pale? Like, is it looking like it's suffering from oxygen lack? And then is it breathing, right? And so it's kind of interesting. I want you to kind of just know that point, that like those are the 5 things they look for right at the start, right? And this is gonna be like in a split second for an actual nurse. Like, is the baby moving? Do we find a pulse? Is it breathing? Is it reacting with reflexes to stimulation? And does it look like its circulation is working, basically? And a no to any of those is a reason for concern. Just fire through a few bullet points here. This chapter summary. Evolution proposes that natural selection fuels adaptation to promote an organism's survival in a natural habitat, so in the world it's in. Evolutionary psychology holds that adaptation, reproduction, and survival of the fittest are important in shaping behavior. Evolutionary developmental psychology emphasizes that humans need an extended juvenile period to develop their large brains and to learn the complexities of social communities. Except in the sperm and egg, the nucleus of each human cell contains 46 chromosomes, which are composed of DNA. Then I'm thinking, if you're watching this and you want to write this down, you can just pause it real quick. Okay, next list. Genes are these short segments of DNA, this hereditary information that collaboratively directs cells to reproduce and then manufacture proteins. Genes are passed on to new cells when chromosomes are duplicated during these processes that we talked about, mitosis and meiosis. genetic principles including those involving dominant recessive genes, sex-linked genes, and polygenetic inheritance. We didn't talk a ton about this, but we will at different points, is that issues with chromosome abnormalities can be linked to certain conditions such as Down syndrome, Fragile X syndrome. So there are significant problems when this copying of chromosomes, when there's any kind of issue with the process. All right, and those are very complex things that I'll talk about at a later date. The epigenetic view emphasizes that development is actually the result of this ongoing both-way bidirectional interchange between heredity and environment. Interest in developing regarding how genes influence, or how gene interactions influence development, and may be transferred intergenerationally, right? So I messed that sentence up. Let me do that again. Interest is developing regarding how gene interaction influences development and may be transferred intergenerationally, like how things are passed. I gave the example of the cortisol, like the stress hormone in mice. Okay. So the interaction of heredity and environment is complex, but we can create unique developmental paths by changing our environment, right? That it's nurture does matter, nature matters, they both shape each other. We talked about how chance matters too. Prenatal development can be divided into these three kind of developmental periods: germinal, embryonic, and fetal. Epigenetic studies indicate that while early bonding is not critical or always possible, it's helpful for the development of the competent infant. Yeah, and it's it's not always possible because I don't know, maybe the kid's really sick in a intensive care, but I don't know, I like that statement. I don't love that sentence. It's not only not helpful, it's attention and care and love early on in the child's life is absolutely key. And when it's a scenario where the child's in an incubator, there's that's almost such a specific scenario, because that's a scenario where as much touch as possible, if touch is allowed. If touch isn't allowed, then as much eye contact as possible becomes absolutely paramount. And it's oftentimes when mothers have kids that have some kind of problem, that problem makes them more nervous with their kid and interact with their kid less. And actually what's bad for the kid is that reduced interaction. So it's yeah, that early stimulation is so important. I want to thank you for hanging out with me. This has been, I know, a kind of long presentation. The next presentation like this that I'll be doing will be on mess that word up, infancy. I say there next week. It's actually not going to be, it will be next week. It won't be this week, because this week I'm going to do the first project, okay? And that'll be coming out closer to the weekend. All right, my friends, maybe even on the weekend. So this weekend, be ready for the first assignment, and you'll have time to do it. So it's not like you have to be ready to do it, but just be on the look for the first digital workshop coming soon, Giants of Psychology. I think you'll love it, and I hope you're doing well. And once I get that out to you, hopefully by the end of this current week, then I'm basically caught up. And yeah, you've been awesome to work with so far, and I hope you're enjoying these lectures. Cheers.